Did you know that out of the 11 Southeast Asian countries, 10 were colonized by the Europeans? But how? And why? This is the entire timeline of how European powers raced to colonize Southeast Asia. Disclaimer: I'm going to be very brief with the history, and there may be some inaccuracies or information missing, so bear that in mind while watching this video. The first European power to reach Southeast Asia was Portugal in 1511. They did this by traveling around Africa, stopping in India, and then continued heading eastwards. On this journey, however, they discovered that the spices popular in European cuisines and used in medicines originated in South and Southeast Asia. For almost 5,000 years, spices came to Europe via Arabs in the Middle East, so this discovery gave them an opportunity to gain control of the spice trade and monopolize it. They first took control of Malacca, a city on the Malay Peninsula. In 1515, the Portuguese reached Timor-Leste, and this began European colonization of Southeast Asia. By 1530, the Portuguese occupied some islands in the Moluccas. They sourced nutmeg, cloves, and cinnamon, which were prized by the Europeans as flavors, preservatives, and medicine. This also gave its nickname the Spice Islands. By 1560, the Portuguese occupied some more islands in the Moluccas and a small region in East Java. A year later, they occupied these islands and parts of Mindanao. Then, in 1565, a new European power colonized Southeast Asia. It was the Spanish, and they arrived from Mexico. They wanted to get a piece of the spice trade pie, so they found an alternative route to Southeast Asia that would avoid the Portuguese. They actually discovered a route to the Philippines from the Strait of Magellan in South America 44 years prior. However, they failed to colonize at the time due to resistance from the natives. So in 1565, the Spanish arrived with a mere 500 men and conquered Cebu. By 1570, they occupied Panay, this island, Masbate, and the Romblon Island group. The Portuguese lost control of these islands and parts of Mindanao. By 1579, the Spanish occupied Samar, Leyte, Bohol, Catanduanes, Polillo, parts of Luzon, and parts of Mindanao. The Portuguese lost control of more islands in the Moluccas. In 1580, Portugal and Spain formed the Iberian Union. This was because of the Portuguese succession crisis where the King of Portugal and his successors died, lacking immediate heirs to the throne. It's a whole other story, but all you need to know is that it brought the entire Portuguese and Spanish overseas possessions under one. They also lost control of even more islands in the Moluccas. By 1590, the Iberian Union occupied Mindoro, parts of Palawan, and more parts of Luzon. By 1601, the Iberian Union occupied all of Luzon. Then, in 1602, a new European power emerged. It was the Dutch. The Dutch saw the Portuguese as highly profitable spices which were in high demand in Europe, so they were motivated to colonize Southeast Asia, expecting to make large profits sending spices back to Europe. So in 1602, the Dutch occupied a small part of the Malay Peninsula. By 1604, the Dutch occupied a small part of East Java, a small part of Banten, and a small part of Borneo. Then in 1605, England entered Southeast Asia. They also wanted to challenge the Portuguese monopoly of trade with Asia, so they financed voyages to the region, aiming to tap into the spice trade. So in 1605, they occupied a small part of Borneo near the Dutch. By 1610, the Iberian Union occupied most of the Moluccas, parts of West Papua, and parts of Sulawesi. In 1611, the Dutch occupied a small part of Banten, which is now Jakarta. By 1620, the Dutch took over some parts of the Iberian Union's Timor-Leste and occupied a small part of Sumatra and more of what's now Jakarta. The English occupied another small part of Borneo. By 1640, the Dutch lost control of a small part of Sumatra, and the Iberian Union lost control of a small part of Central Java. The Iberian Union also broke up into Portugal and Spain. In 1641, the Dutch took over Portugal's Malacca. The Dutch, along with local Javanese allies numbered around 700 men, assaulted and wrested Malacca from the Portuguese because it was and still is a very strategic point, as it allows transit for ships between the Middle East and East Asia. They held on to the territory to prevent other European powers from taking it and being able to compete in the region. By 1650, the Dutch occupied islands in the Moluccas. By 1670, the Spanish lost control of the Moluccas, parts of West Papua, and parts of Sulawesi. The Dutch occupied some parts of Sulawesi and some parts of Lesser Sunda Islands. By 1680, the Dutch occupied more parts of Java. By 1690, the Dutch occupied even more parts of Java and Sulawesi. The English occupied a small part of Sumatra. And by 1700, the Dutch occupied more parts of Sulawesi. The English also occupied more parts of Sumatra. In 1702, although Timor-Leste was already occupied by the Portuguese, it wasn't declared a Portuguese territory until this very year. They held on to Timor-Leste mainly to reap profits from the region's rich coffee plantations. By 1707, the English occupied more parts of Sumatra. England also united with Scotland to become Great Britain, so overseas territories were under the British. The Dutch occupied more parts of Java. By 1750, nothing much changed other than the Dutch occupying losing more territories in the region. By 1760, the Spanish occupied more parts of Mindanao. In 1771, the British occupied Penang, but it wasn't until 1786 when they officially colonized the Penang Island. They obtained it from the rulers of the island in exchange for military aid because they saw the strategic potential of it. It could enable the British to check other European powers' territorial ambitions in Southeast Asia. From 1780 to 1784, the Fourth War between the British and the Dutch occurred. This was because the Dutch were secretly trading with the American colonies, who at the time were revolting against England for independence. After the war, however, the Dutch colonial empire began to decline as a result of being overwhelmed from the war. So after the Dutch occupied more parts of Borneo and Sumatra by 1792, in 1795 the British intermittently took over Netherlands, Malacca and parts of Sumatra. By 1800 the British occupied more parts of Penang. In 1806 the British occupied Bangka Belitung. At this time the Dutch were also under the French kingdom, after Napoleon dominated over continental Europe, which included Netherlands. However, the East Indies were treated as a proxy French colony and were still administered by the Dutch. By 1810 the British took over Netherlands islands in the Moluccas, parts of West Papua and parts of Sulawesi. In 1811 the British took over all of Netherlands territories in the region. This was because they wanted to conquer the Spice Islands, and it also meant a reduction of Dutch and French trade and power in the region, as well as a gain of rich trade in spices. However, in 1816 they gave it all back. This was because the British wanted to create a strong ally on continental Europe that could deter future French aggression. They also showed no interest in hanging on to them, so they were returned to the Dutch. In 1818 the Dutch took back control of Malacca from the British. In 1819 the British occupied Singapore. This was because they were still determined to replace the Netherlands as a dominant power in the archipelago, since the trade route between China and India had become vitally important. Singapore happened to be strategically located along the main trade route, so they sought after it. The ruler of Singapore granted the British the right to establish a trading post on the island, and in return the ruler received money. In 1824 the British began to occupy Myanmar. Their reason was that they wanted to expand the British's sphere of influence. They were also anxious about the French using harbours in the Burmese Empire, as the French was attempting to extend its influence in Southeast Asia. In 1825 the Dutch ceded Malacca to the British, and a year later the British formed the Strait Settlements comprising Penang, Malacca and Singapore. By 1830 the Dutch occupied more parts of Sumatra. The British lost control of Sumatra and occupied more parts of Myanmar. By 1840 the Dutch occupied almost all of Java and a majority of Sumatra. In 1848, the British occupied Labuan. They expected this territory to be a second Singapore, however it failed because coal production in Labuan did not become productive. In 1851, the Spanish occupied North Borneo. In 1852, the British occupied more parts of Myanmar. And in 1858, the final European power arrived in Southeast Asia. It was the French. The decision for the French to colonize in the region wasn't just because of religious efforts to spread Christianity. France was seeing a big boost in its capitalist economy, which means they were making more money through business and trade. With this economic growth, there was a growing need for new markets overseas to sell their goods. Additionally, France wanted to get a bigger piece of the Asian territories that had already been taken over by other European powers. So it was partly about making money and partly about expanding French influence in Asia. So in 1858, they invaded Da Nang and Saigon in Vietnam. In 1859, the Dutch and the Portuguese signed the Treaty of Lisbon, which divided Timor like this. This was because they had been continually conflicting with each other for control over Timor, so they agreed to divide the island. By 1870, France occupied more parts of Vietnam and parts of Cambodia. In 1874, the British occupied Perak, Selangor and Negeri Sembilan. By 1880, the British occupied North Borneo. By 1890, the French occupied most of Vietnam, more parts of Cambodia and parts of Laos to officially become French Indochina. In the Malay Peninsula, the British occupied Pahang, which became part of the Federated Malay States, and in Borneo, the British occupied Raj of Sarawak and Brunei. In 1893, the French occupied more parts of Cambodia and Laos, and in 1899, the Spanish lost control of the Philippines. This was because of the Spanish-American War, which began in the aftermath of the mysterious explosion of the Americans' battleship USS Maine in Havana Harbor. In Manila, a battle was fought between the Americans and the Spanish, and when the Americans won, the Philippines became an unofficial colony of the United States. So in 1899, the Spanish was the first European power to leave Southeast Asia. By 1900, the Dutch had occupied almost all of what's now Indonesia. In 1909, the British occupied Perlis, Kedah, Kelantan, and Terengganu. In 1914, the British occupied Johor, and by 1939, we see the greatest extent of colonialism in the region. You can see how similar the borders are to present-day Southeast Asia. The Dutch have completely colonized Indonesia, the British occupied what Malaysia, Singapore, Brunei, and Myanmar are today, the French have taken control of Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, Portuguese occupied what's now Timor-Leste, and the US, although not European, European have colonized the Philippines. However, this was also the year that World War II began, and you know what that means. In 1940, the Japanese began to invade French Indochina. In 1941, the Japanese invaded all of French Indochina, Thailand, some parts of British territories, and some parts of the Philippines. In 1942, the Japanese invaded almost all of European territories in Southeast Asia. But in 1944, the Japanese began to lose control of territories. The Dutch reclaimed parts of West Papua, and the US gained back parts of the Philippines. By 1945, the Japanese have left, and territories were returned to the Europeans. However, after the war, countries in Southeast Asia wanted to become independent after seeing that Europeans were far from invincible. So this sparked a wave of independence across the region, as they refused to live again under European rule. In 1945, parts of Dutch East Indies declared Indonesian independence from the Dutch. Vietnam proclaimed independence from the French, however it wasn't until later that the French actually left the region. In 1946, the Philippines attained independence from the United States. In 1948, Burma achieved independence from the British. In 1949, more Dutch territories became part of Indonesia. Dutch and Indonesian representatives also signed an agreement which formally provided independence for Indonesia. In 1953, Laos and Cambodia gained independence from the French. In 1955, the French finally pulled out of Vietnam. In 1957, Malaya achieved independence from the British. In 1962, the Dutch turned over their last possession in Southeast Asia to Indonesia. In 1963, Sabah, Sarawak, and Singapore became independent and joined Malaya to form Malaysia. In 1975, Timor-Leste declared itself independent from Portugal. However, by 1980, they were invaded by Indonesia and was incorporated as a province. And finally, in 1984, Brunei gained its independence from the United Kingdom, and this ended European colonialism in Southeast Asia. Fast forward to today, this is what Southeast Asia looks like. You may not have realized it, but European colonization had definitely influenced how Southeast Asian countries drew up their borders today. Now that you've reached the end, subscribe for more Southeast Asian content.